Hello. Tonight we follow a thread of human longing that stretches back more than 2,000 years, to a time when the southernmost place on Earth existed only as a dream. This is not simply the story of how Antarctica was discovered, but of why we needed it to be there long before anyone ever saw its ice. The Greeks gave us the idea of a vast southern continent, and that idea would not let go of the human imagination, drifting through centuries like fog across an unmapped sea. Consider the mind of the ancient geographer, working by lamplight in Alexandria or Athens, piecing together the world from fragments of sailor stories and pure reason. The Earth, they believed, was a sphere. This much they knew from shadows cast during lunar eclipses and the way ships disappeared hull first over the horizon. But a sphere required balance. The great land masses of the North Europe, Asia, the rumored edges of Africa must, by logic, be counterweighted by something equally vast in the south. Otherwise would not the world simply tip over? And so they gave it a name. Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. They drew it on their maps, a generous curl of continent wrapping the bottom of the world, though no eye had ever traced its coast. The dream persisted because it had to. When the Roman Empire rose and fell, when the great library at Alexandria burned, when the Mediterranean world shrank into the confines of medieval thought, the idea of the southern continent slept, but did not die. It passed into the hands of Arab geographers, then back to European cartographers, who filled the blank spaces of their maps with speculation. By the 15th century, as Portuguese caravels began feeling their way down the coast of Africa, the maps showed Terra Australis as a certainty, not a possibility. There it sat, vast and patient, waiting to be found. What did they imagine, those men who inked its contours? They gave it mountains and rivers, forests and cities, sometimes even inhabitants. They imagined it temperate and welcoming, a mirror of the north where resources waited and trade routes could be extended. The fog that clung to the southern oceans in their minds was not an obstacle but a veil, something to be parted by courage and good seamanship. They did not imagine ice. They could not. The human mind struggles to conceive what it has never touched, and no one had yet touched Antarctica. So the centuries passed, and the southern continent remained a theory, a necessary blank spot on the map, where sailors reported colder waters, strange birds, and a quality of light that suggested something vast beyond the horizon. When Ferdinand Magellan passed through the strait that bears his name in 1520, he believed the land to his south, Tierra del Fuego, was the edge of the great southern continent. He was wrong, but the error took generations to correct. Each voyage into the high southern latitudes brought mariners closer to a place that existed first in the mind, then on paper, and only finally in ice and rock. Here is the quiet paradox that would haunt explorers for 300 years. They were searching for something they already believed in. The continent did not need to be discovered to be real. It was real in the same way that paradise is real, or the edge of the world, or any place that lies just beyond the reach of experience. The maps showed it. The philosophers confirmed it. The logic of symmetry demanded it. All that remained was to step onto its shore and prove what everyone already knew must be true. And so the dream of the Greeks passed like an inheritance to every sailor who looked south and wondered what lay beneath the strange clouds, beyond the wandering icebergs. In that region of the world, where the sea grew cold and the night stretched longer than they should. They carried that dream in the timber of their ships, in the ink of their charts, in the quiet conversations held in the dark between one watch and the next. The unknown southern land was waiting. It had always been waiting, and it would continue to wait, patient as only something that does not know it is being watched can be, until the day when fog parted and ice revealed itself at last. Before the dreamers, before the maps, before any human eye ever turned southward with intention, there was only the continent itself, alone in the darkness, at the bottom of the world. For millions of years, Antarctica existed without witness. No one saw the snow fall. No one heard the wind. No one watched the slow dance of the aurora as it pulsed across a sky that might as well have belonged to another planet. The silence was absolute, not because sound was absent, but because there was no ear to receive it. Consider what it means for a place to be truly alone. The forests of other continents rustled with life, with birds calling and insects humming, and the footfalls of creatures great and small. Even the deepest oceans carried the songs of whales, the clicks of dolphins, the endless conversation of a living world. But Antarctica, for most of its existence, offered nothing of the kind. It was a desert of ice and rock, so cold that life could barely gain a foothold even at its edges. Inland, across the vast plateau where the ice piles miles deep, nothing moved, nothing breathed, nothing waited. And yet the continent was not still. The ice itself was alive in its own slow way, flowing toward the sea at a pace too gradual for any creature to perceive. Glaciers carved the rock beneath them, grinding mountains into dust over epochs. The wind scoured the surface, lifting snow from one place and depositing it in another, sculpting the landscape into forms that would shift and change across centuries. The stars wheeled overhead in their slow procession, and the aurora cracked and whispered in the thin, cold air. All of this happened. All of this was real. But without a witness, was it sound or only vibration? Was it movement or only the turning of the world? This is the paradox that clings to Antarctica like frost. A tree falling in an empty forest makes a pressure wave that could become sound if ears were present. But what of a continent where no ears ever existed? The wind howled across the polar plateau for 100 million years before the first human heard anything like it. The question is not whether the sound was there, but whether silence can be said to exist when there is no one to experience its opposite. The long loneliness of Antarctica was not a punishment or a blessing. It was simply the condition of the place, as natural as the cold. The continent drifted southward over geological time, settling into its polar position like a sleeper turning toward the wall. As it cooled, as the ice accumulated, as the last hardy plants gave up their hold on the warming world, Antarctica became what it was always tending toward, a place apart. Not hostile exactly, because hostility requires intention, simply indifferent, simply empty, simply waiting in a way that only something without consciousness can wait. When the first humans finally drew near, centuries after the Greeks had imagined it, they came as intruders upon a silence that had never been broken. Their ships creaked, their voices carried. Their boots crunched against snow that had lain undisturbed since before their ancestors had learned to walk upright. And in making those sounds, they changed something fundamental about the place. Not the ice, not the wind, not the patient grinding of glaciers against stone, but the quality of the silence itself. Because once a place has been witnessed, it can never again be truly alone. The memory of sound lingers, even when the sound has faded. The continent had entered human awareness, and though it would remain the quietest place on Earth, the absolute silence of its youth was gone forever. The summer of 1820 arrived quietly in the Southern Ocean, though summer is perhaps too generous a word for that brief softening of the long polar cold. In January and February of that year, 3 ships, belonging to 3 different nations, approached the edge of the unknown with no knowledge of one another's proximity. Their crews shared the same hopes, the same fears, the same salt-stung eyes, searching a horizon that offered nothing but fog and ice and the strange flat light of high latitudes. And in that season of blurred boundaries between sea and sky, between cloud and coast, between dream and discovery, each of them may have seen what no human had ever seen. The first was a Russian expedition under the command of Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, sailing south on a mission ordered by Tsar Alexander I. His ships, the Vostok and the Mirny, had pushed through pack ice and past wandering icebergs, further south than any Russian had gone before. On the 27th of January, 1820, In the coordinates that would later be known as the Princess Martha Coast, Bellingshausen recorded in his log the presence of solid ice stretching to the horizon. Ice of a kind different from the floating pack they had navigated for weeks. He wrote of ice hills, of ice that seemed to rise and continue inland. He did not claim to have seen land. He was too careful, too scientific, too aware that light plays tricks in these waters. But he had seen something, and that something was the continent itself, wearing its mantle of frozen shelf ice, revealing only its edge and nothing more. Less than 3 days later, on January 30, a British expedition under William Smith and Edward Bransfield approached from a different angle, charting what would later be called the Antarctic Peninsula. From the brig Williams, men peered through telescopes at a coastline of black rock rising through the ice, mountains wearing caps of snow, a shoreline that did not waver or dissolve as they watched. They named what they saw Trinity Peninsula, believing it to be part of a larger landmass. They were right, though they could not prove it. The coast receded into fog before they could set foot upon it, and the sea ice prevented any closer approach. They had seen the continent. They had named a piece of it. But the uncertainty lingered like the mist that swallowed their discovery. And then, in November of the same year, an American sealer named Nathaniel Palmer, commanding a tiny sloop called the Hero, pushed southward in search of new hunting grounds. He was 21 years old, young enough to carry wonder like a spare sail. Through the fog that parted and closed again like breathing, he glimpsed mountainous coastline to the south, a land of rock and ice, where no map showed anything but open ocean. He returned to his base at Deception Island and reported what he had seen to the British officer present there. The continent had been glimpsed again by a boy in a boat small enough to be swallowed by the waves he crossed. Here is the strange mercy of that season of discovery. None of these men knew they were part of something larger. Bellingshausen returned to Russia, believing he had seen only ice. Bransfield and Smith reported land, but their reports mingled with others and faded into the slow current of official correspondence. Palmer told his story, and it was believed, but his sighting came months after the others, and the question of priority would occupy historians for generations. The continent had been found, but finding required knowing, and knowing required proof, and proof required landing, and that would come later, in another decade, by other men. What they shared, these first witnesses, was something quieter than triumph. It was the experience of standing at the edge of certainty, peering through glass at a shoreline that might have been solid, or might have been cloud, might have been the edge of the world, or only another trick of polar light. They wrote their observations in logbooks by lantern light, choosing words carefully, refusing to claim more than they could defend. And in that restraint, they honored the mystery of the place they had found. The continent had revealed itself, but only just. It had given them a glimpse, a silhouette, a promise. And then it had withdrawn again into the fog, patient as stone, patient as ice, patient as only something that has waited millions of years can be. To stand upon the Antarctic ice sheet is to find oneself inside a geometry lesson written at the scale of continents. The whiteness that extends in every direction, that fills the horizon and erases the distinction between earth and sky, is not the blank emptiness it first appears. It is a landscape of mathematical precision, where every curve and facet obeys laws as old as the universe itself. The ice has its own grammar, its own syntax, its own way of arranging matter according to principles that human beings are only beginning to understand. Consider first the surface itself, the skin of snow that covers the Great Plateau. It is not smooth, as the early explorers expected, not a gentle plain of uniform white. The wind, which here has nothing to obstruct it for thousands of miles, sculpts the snow into forms called sastrugi. These are ridges of hard-packed ice, carved by the constant motion of air across the frozen surface. They run in lines that indicate the prevailing wind, sharp-edged on one side, gently sloping on the other, like waves frozen mid-roll in a sea of white. A man walking across Sastrugi feels every ridge beneath his feet, a constant reminder that the air itself is a sculptor, patient and persistent, working day and night without rest. The patterns shift with the seasons, with individual storms, with the subtle variations in temperature that cause snow crystals to bond or slide. Nothing stays the same for long, and yet nothing changes quickly enough to watch. Below the surface, the geometry continues. Snow falls, compresses under its own weight, transforms into firn, then into glacial ice. The process takes centuries, millennia, but the mathematics of it never varies. Each layer preserves something of the moment it fell: the temperature of the air, the chemistry of the atmosphere, the trace elements carried from distant continents by global winds. Scientists who drill cores from the ice read these layers like pages in a book, deciphering the history of the planet. From the silent testimony of frozen water, the ice remembers. It remembers volcanic eruptions that darkened skies on the other side of the world. It remembers the slow rhythm of ice ages coming and going. It remembers the first traces of human industry appearing in the atmosphere, a thin band of ash and chemicals that will remain in the ice long after our cities have crumbled. Where the ice meets the sea, the geometry becomes something else entirely. Ice shelves extend outward from the continent, floating on the water, but still attached to the land behind them. Their edges are cliffs of white and blue, rising sheer from the ocean, sometimes 100 feet high or more. Below the waterline, the ice continues downward, a hidden landscape of peaks and valleys that no human eye will ever see directly. The line where ice meets air, where floating becomes fixed, where the continent ends and the ocean begins, is called the grounding line. It moves with the tides, with the seasons, with the slow breathing of the ice itself. Nothing here is static, though everything appears still. And then there are the crevasses. These are the fractures in the ice, the places where the slow flow of the glacier has pulled apart, opening wounds that can be hundreds of feet deep. They are hidden beneath bridges of snow, waiting for the unwary foot to find them. But they are not silent. The wind moving across their openings creates sounds, low hums and whistles, tones that change with the weather and the season. Early explorers spoke of hearing the ice sing, and they were not wrong. The crevasses are instruments played by the wind, producing music that has no human audience, that has been sounding for millions of years without a single ear to hear it. Light behaves differently here. At certain angles, with the sun low on the horizon, the snow absorbs the red end of the spectrum and reflects the blue, so that shadows appear not black, but deep azure, as if the ice were stained with sky. In the crevasses, the light filters down through layers of compressed snow, turning the walls a color that has no name in any language, a blue so pure it seems to come from somewhere beyond the visible world. On overcast days, the light becomes flat and directionless, erasing all shadow, all texture, all sense of depth. Men have died in such conditions, unable to see the slope beneath their feet, stepping into space where they believed solid ground to be. The ice crystals themselves are a universe of geometry. Each snowflake that falls here carries the same hexagonal symmetry as snowflakes everywhere, but the cold and the dryness give them forms rarely seen elsewhere. They are smaller, harder, more like diamonds than the wet snow of temperate winters. They sparkle in the sun with a brilliance that hurts the eyes, each crystal a tiny prism scattering light in every direction. When the wind lifts them, they become a moving curtain of glitter, a dance of microscopic mirrors between the observer and the sky. This is the paradox that meets every traveler who ventures onto the ice. The closer one looks, the more complexity reveals itself. What seemed empty is full. What seemed still is moving. What seemed silent is humming with frequencies beyond the range of human hearing. The geometry of snow is not a simple thing. It is the language in which the continent speaks to those patient enough to listen, a language of curves and angles, of light and shadow, of forms that have been perfecting themselves since before there were eyes to see them. The first men who chose to stay through an Antarctic winter did so in a place called Cape Adare, at the edge of the Ross Sea, where a narrow spit of volcanic rock pushes out from the continent like a last gesture before the ice takes over. They arrived in February of 1899, 9 men under the command of Carsten Borchgrevink, a Norwegian explorer with the kind of quiet determination that the age of polar discovery seemed to produce in abundance. They had a ship, the Southern Cross, which deposited them with their supplies and their dogs and their prefabricated wooden hut, and then sailed away, leaving them alone on a shore that had never known a human winter. The hut was their entire world. It measured perhaps 20 feet by 20, a single room with bunks along the walls, a kitchen at one end, and a skylight in the roof that would soon be buried under snow. They built it from numbered planks shipped from Norway, fitting the pieces together on that exposed beach, while the sun still circled overhead, never quite setting, never quite rising, just tracing its endless shallow loop around the sky. They worked quickly, because they could feel the season turning. The air carried a new edge. The sea ice was forming in the shallows. The penguins that had crowded the beach were beginning to thin out, heading for open water, and whatever instinct told them was safety. By early May, the sun made its final appearance. It rose later each day, arced lower across the northern horizon, and then one afternoon it simply failed to return. The twilight lingered for a while, a band of pale light along the northern edge of the world, but it too faded with each passing day until there was nothing left but darkness and stars. This was the moment the men had prepared for but could not truly imagine. The stars they had known all their lives, the familiar constellations of the northern hemisphere, had vanished below the horizon when they crossed the equator. In their place hung a different sky, unfamiliar and vast, centered on the Southern Cross and the 2 bright clouds of Magellan that looked like fragments of the Milky Way torn loose and set adrift. Now those stars did not come and go with the rhythm of night and day. They simply remained, fixed and watching, for week after week after week. Inside the hut, the lamps burned constantly. They burned seal blubber in simple iron stoves, filling the single room with a smell that would never quite wash out of their clothes, or their hair, or their dreams. The light was yellow and soft, insufficient for reading by modern standards, but enough to push back the darkness a few feet from each flame. The men gathered around these small islands of illumination, playing cards, writing in journals, mending socks and mittens, talking in the low voices of those who have learned that sound carries differently when there is no distance for it to travel. Borchgrevink had brought a gramophone and a selection of records, music that seemed to come from another world entirely when heard against the creaking of the hut and the occasional groan of the ice outside. They would wind it up and let the needle find its groove, and for 3 minutes the room would fill with something that was not polar, not dark, not cold. Then the music would end, and the silence would return, deeper than before, as if the continent were asserting its primacy over any sound that human beings could make. The routine was everything. They ate at regular hours, even when their bodies could no longer tell what hour it was. They took turns, keeping the meteorological instruments clear of frost, recording temperatures that fell to 40 below, and stayed there. They exercised when they could, though the darkness and the cold made any excursion beyond the hut a calculated risk. They watched each other for signs of the thing they feared most but never named, the slow unraveling of minds deprived of light, of variety, of the simple comfort of a horizon that changes. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the light began to return. In late July, a faint glow appeared at noon along the northern horizon, a promise more than a presence. By August, the twilight lasted long enough to read by for an hour each day. By September, the sun itself broke the horizon, a thin crescent of fire that lifted and then sank again, as if testing whether it was welcome. The men stood outside and watched it, their faces turned toward that warmth they could not feel, their eyes watering in the sudden brilliance. The stars had ruled the sky for 4 months, and now they were retreating, handing back their dominion to the light. But the men who watched knew something they had not known before, that the stars would return again, that the darkness was not an interruption, but a presence, not an absence, but a thing in itself, patient and vast, and older than any human understanding of time. The names that echo through the heroic age of Antarctic exploration are the names of men who pushed themselves beyond the limits of human endurance, who crossed crevasses and climbed glaciers and pressed forward into the unknown until their bodies could carry them no further. Robert Falcon Scott, Ernest Shackleton, Roald Amundsen. These figures occupy a place in history reserved for those who dared greatly and, in some cases, died trying. But the truth of their existence in the ice, the reality that filled the months and years they spent at the bottom of the world, was not composed of heroic gestures alone. It was made of smaller things, of routines so ordinary they would barely merit mention in a temperate climate, of habits repeated until they became automatic, until they became the scaffolding upon which survival itself depended. Consider the matter of tea. In every expedition hut, at every camp along the route south, the preparation of tea followed a ritual as precise as any religious observance. The water must be melted from snow, and not just any snow, but the right snow, old, compacted snow that contained less air and yielded more water for the same volume. The melting took time, required fuel that was carefully measured and rationed, and so the man tasked with brewing tea learned to begin the process long before thirst announced itself. He learned to listen for the particular sound of water reaching a boil in that thin, cold air, a sound different from boiling at sea level. He learned the exact moment to add the leaves, the precise interval to let them steep, the way to pour so that the heat was not wasted on frozen cups. A dozen times a day, this ritual unfolded, and in its repetition, it gave structure to hours that otherwise held none. The same attention to small things governed every aspect of polar existence. When a man returned from a journey outside the hut, his first task was not to rest, but to attend to his clothing. Frost accumulated in the fibers of parkas and trousers, in the fur of mittens and the wool of balaclavas. If allowed to remain, it would melt against the warmth of the hut and soak the garments, and soaked garments in this climate were a death sentence. So the returning traveller stood in the entrance passage, beating the frost from his clothing, shaking each piece methodically, hanging it on nails, driven into the wall at precisely the right distance from the stove. This too became ritual. This too became the unspoken language of survival. In the evenings, after the outdoor work was done, and the dogs had been fed, and the meteorological instruments had been read and recorded, the men gathered in the common space of the hut. They sat on boxes or benches or the edges of their bunks, and they read. Scott's men at Cape Evans had a library of several hundred volumes, chosen with care before the expedition sailed. There were novels and poetry collections, works of history and exploration, a few volumes of scripture, and at least one book on the identification of Antarctic birds. A man might spend weeks with the same book, reading slowly, savoring each page, because there would be no new pages until the ship returned. They discussed what they read, sometimes, but just as often they sat in companionable silence, the only sounds the turning of pages and the crackle of the stove and the wind working against the walls outside. Shackleton, during the Nimrod expedition of 1907 to 1909, brought a small printing press and produced a magazine called the Aurora Australis, the first book ever written, printed, illustrated, and bound in Antarctica. The men contributed essays and poems and sketches, working by lamplight in the hut at Cape Royds, passing their creations from hand to hand. The pages were printed on a hand press, one sheet at a time, and bound in covers made from packing materials. It was a small thing, a distraction, a way of filling hours that stretched longer than any hours have a right to stretch. But it was also something more. It was an assertion that human life, even at the edge of the habitable world, even in the darkness of the polar night, could still produce something that was not merely survival, but culture, not merely endurance, but meaning. Amundsen's men, preparing for their successful assault on the South Pole in 1911, approached routine with an almost military precision. Every man knew his duties, knew the order in which tasks would be performed, knew the schedule that governed each day. They ate at the same hours, slept at the same hours, rose at the same hours. Their sledging rations were weighed and packed with a care that bordered on obsession. Their depots were laid with a redundancy that ensured no single failure could doom the enterprise. This was not the stuff of legend, not the material from which dramatic narratives are constructed, but it was the stuff of success. It was the quiet discipline that allowed Amundsen and his 4 companions to reach the pole and return, while Scott and his men perished on the same journey, their heroism unmatched but their routines, in the end, insufficient to the demands the ice made upon them. The diaries left by these men reveal the texture of that ordinary existence. Scott, in his final tent, writing letters to the families of his dead companions, to the public who had funded his expedition, to his wife and son. His handwriting, preserved in the archives, shows the same steady hand that recorded temperatures and wind speeds, that noted the condition of the dogs and the quality of the snow. Even at the end, even with death waiting outside the canvas, the habit of recording persisted. The routine held. This is what the ice teaches, if it teaches anything at all. That heroism is not a single act, but 1,000 small acts repeated until they become instinct. That survival is not a matter of grand gestures, but of tea brewed at the right hour, of frost shaken from clothing before it can melt, of pages turned in the yellow light of a blubber lamp while the wind scours the darkness outside and finds no purchase. The men of the heroic age were bold, yes, but they were bold in the morning when they rose and made their breakfast, bold in the evening when they mended their socks and wrote their journals and prepared to do it all again the next day. And in that ordinary boldness, they found the strength to endure what no human beings had ever been asked to endure before. The sound reached them before the landscape could resolve itself, a drone so unfamiliar in that place that it seemed to belong to a different world altogether. On the 16th of November 1928, from a makeshift runway of snow at Deception Island, a Lockheed Vega monoplane lifted into the Antarctic sky with Hubert Wilkins at the controls and Carl Ben Eilson in the pilot's seat. The engine noise scattered across the ice, echoed off the mountains, rolled across waters that had heard nothing louder than the crack of carving ice for millions of years. For the first time, a machine had taken flight over the frozen continent, and the silence that had reigned since the beginning of the world was broken by a sound that spoke of human ingenuity, human restlessness, and human desire to see what lay beyond the next ridge. The flight lasted barely 20 minutes, a brief hop more symbolic than exploratory, but it opened a door that could never be closed again. Wilkins and Eilson had already made history earlier that same year, completing the first transpolar flight across the Arctic from Alaska to Spitsbergen. Now they brought their experience south, their Lockheed Vega equipped with skis for landing on ice and extra fuel tanks for ranges that earlier explorers could only dream of covering. The plane had been built for speed and endurance, its wooden monocoque fuselage sleek and strong, its single engine capable of pushing it through the thin, cold air at speeds that would have astonished the men who had hauled sledges across these same latitudes only a decade before. A month later, on December 20, they went further. Taking off again from Deception Island, they flew south across the Bransfield Strait, over the mountains of the Antarctic Peninsula, and into territory no human eye had ever surveyed from above. For nearly 600 miles, they traced the coastline, peered down at the Larsen ice shelf, watched the mountains give way to plateaus, and the plateaus dissolve into white horizons that stretched toward the pole. Below them, the continent revealed its true scale. What had taken Scott and Shackleton months to cross on foot, what had required depots and dogs, and the calculated expenditure of every ounce of strength, now passed beneath the wings in hours. From the air, the geography of Antarctica announced itself in a new language. The mountains that had seemed so formidable to men on the ground became wrinkles in a vast white tapestry. The glaciers that had taken days to cross resolved into streaks of slower ice flowing between ridges. The distant horizon, which had always receded before the sledge traveler, remained fixed and knowable, a line that could be reached and crossed and left behind with the simple application of throttle. Wilkins and Eielson photographed what they saw, sketched what they could not photograph, and returned to their ship in time for dinner. As Wilkins later noted with the quiet understatement that characterized his generation of explorers, they had covered nearly 1,300 miles and discovered several new islands, and they sat down to eat in a warm wardroom as if they had done nothing more remarkable than take an afternoon stroll. But the flight changed something fundamental in the human relationship with Antarctica. The continent had always revealed itself grudgingly, meter by meter, through the exhausted eyes of men who had earned every glimpse with physical labor. Now it could be seen whole. Now its patterns could be traced from above, its mountain ranges understood as systems, its coastlines mapped with a speed that would have seemed magical to the previous generation. The airplane did not eliminate the need for ground exploration, if anything. It created new questions that only men on the ice could answer, but it transformed the scale on which those questions could be asked. Other aviators followed quickly. Richard Byrd arrived at the Bay of Whales in January 1929 with a fleet of aircraft and a base he called Little America. From there, he would launch the first flight over the South Pole itself on November 29 of that year, circling the point where Amundsen and Scott had stood and looking down on the infinite white plain that had cost those men their lives. Byrd's flight took less than 16 hours round trip. The achievement was breathtaking, and it was also sobering. The airplane had not diminished the heroism of those who had gone before. It had simply revealed, from a height of several thousand feet, how vast the stage was upon which their dramas had been enacted. For the men in those open cockpits, for the pilots who guided their fragile machines through the uncertain air above an unmapped continent, the experience carried its own particular quality of awe. They were tiny specks above an infinite white ocean, suspended between the ice below and the cold above, their engines the only thread connecting them to the world they had left behind. The noise was constant, a vibration that traveled through the airframe and into their bones, and yet beneath it, or beyond it, they could feel the presence of something older and larger than any machine. The continent was watching. It had always been watching. And now, for the first time, it was being watched in return from a perspective that revealed not just its edges, but its heart. The year 1957 arrived in Antarctica with a quality of purpose that the continent had never known before. Across the frozen expanse, at stations scattered along the coast and on the plateau, men and women from 12 nations prepared for 18 months of coordinated scientific observation, unlike anything attempted in human history. The International Geophysical Year, as it was called, had been conceived in the quiet rooms of academies and learned societies. A plan to study the Earth as a single system, to measure its magnetic fields and atmospheric currents, its ice sheets and ocean depths, all at once, all together, as if the planet itself were the subject of a single vast experiment. And at the bottom of the world, where the cold reached depths that strained the limits of human endurance, that experiment would find its purest expression. The Americans built a station at the South Pole itself, hauling timber and steel across thousands of miles of ice, assembling a base at the one point on the continent where every direction was north. They called it Amundsen Scott, honoring the two explorers who had first reached that spot nearly half a century before. The French established a base in Adélie Land, the Australians at Mawson, the Belgians far inland on the polar plateau. The British continued their long presence at sites like Halley Bay, while the Japanese, the Norwegians, the New Zealanders, and the South Africans all contributed stations and personnel. And the Soviets, who had only recently entered the Antarctic arena, built Mirny on the coast and Vostok on the high plateau, the latter destined to become the coldest regularly inhabited place on Earth. What happened at these stations in the months that followed was not simply science, it was something rarer and more fragile. Men who might have faced each other across the dividing lines of the Cold War who belonged to nations armed with nuclear weapons and mutual suspicion, found themselves sharing cramped quarters in the most hostile environment on the planet. At the South Pole, Americans and New Zealanders worked side by side, their accents merging into a dialect of shared purpose. At Murney, Soviet glaciologists welcomed visiting French colleagues, showing them core samples and explaining their methods through a mixture of halting English, technical French, and the universal language of gesture and enthusiasm. At the Little Wilkes station, Australians and Americans celebrated holidays together, their radios crackling with greetings exchanged across the ice. The aurora australis pulsed overhead through the long winter night, green and red and violet curtains of light that shifted and danced in ways that no artificial illumination could match. The scientists stepped outside to watch it, their breath freezing on their collars, their instruments recording the magnetic disturbances that accompanied each shimmering display. They were studying the phenomenon, measuring it, analyzing its frequencies and intensities, but they were also simply watching it, together, as human beings had watched the skies, since before there was science to explain what they saw. And in those moments, the differences of nationality and language and political allegiance seemed as insubstantial as the aurora itself. The collaboration extended beyond the social. Data flowed between stations by radio, by handwritten notes carried on supply flights, by the slow accumulation of shared understanding. When American scientists needed to compare their ionospheric readings with simultaneous observations from the Soviet Vostok station, they radioed their counterparts and arranged the exchange. When the British at Halley Bay detected unusual seismic activity, they passed the information to the Belgians, who were studying the same region from a different angle. The ice itself became a medium of connection, a common subject that required no translation and admitted no national boundaries. In the huts and laboratories, the daily rituals of polar life continued. Coffee was brewed and shared, the particular blends of each nation becoming topics of friendly debate. Americans introduced their Australian colleagues to canned pumpkin at Thanksgiving, while the Australians taught their American friends to appreciate the subtle variations among Vegemite, Promite, and Marmite. The French, wherever they were stationed, somehow produced meals that transcended the limitations of dehydrated ingredients and frozen storage. Bread was baked, its aroma filling the confined spaces with a smell that spoke of home and hearth and all the ordinary comforts that seemed so distant from this frozen world. The International Geophysical Year ended officially on the 31st of December 1958, but something had begun that could not be ended by a calendar. The scientists who had shared those 18 months returned to their home institutions, carrying memories not only of data and discoveries, but of friendships formed in the most unlikely place on Earth. They had proven that the continent could be a laboratory for peaceful cooperation, a zone where the conflicts that divided humanity elsewhere simply had no meaning. And in doing so, they had laid the groundwork for something even more remarkable: the transformation of Antarctica into a place set apart. A continent dedicated not to conquest or possession, but to the quiet pursuit of understanding. The aurora still pulsed overhead, the ice still stretched to every horizon. But now, for the first time, there were people beneath that light, who belonged not to any single nation, but to the continent itself, and to each other. On the 1st of December 1959, in Washington, D.C., representatives from 12 nations gathered around a table and signed their names to a document that had no precedent in human history. The Antarctic Treaty, as it would be known, did not divide territory or establish spheres of influence or allocate resources among the victorious powers. It did something far more unusual. It set aside an entire continent, an area larger than Europe, and declared it forever free of the claims and conflicts that had shaped human affairs everywhere else on the planet. Antarctica would belong to no nation. It would have no weapons, no military bases, no testing of any kind. It would exist for peace alone, and for science, and for the quiet cooperation that the International Geophysical Year had shown to be possible. The treaty emerged from a moment of rare alignment among nations that agreed on little else. The United States and the Soviet Union, locked in the deepest cold of the Cold War, found common ground in the cold of the South. Argentina and Chile, whose Antarctic claims overlapped and conflicted with that of Britain, agreed to set their disputes aside. Norway, which had claimed its sector based on the explorations of Amundsen and others, accepted that claims would be frozen, neither abandoned nor advanced, while the treaty remained in force. Belgium, Japan, South Africa, France, Australia, New Zealand, all signed, all committed, all agreed that this one place would be different. The genius of the treaty lay partly in what it did not try to do. It did not resolve the competing territorial claims that various nations had lodged over the preceding decades. It simply set them aside, shelved them, agreed that they would not be acted upon while the treaty governed Antarctic affairs. A claim could be maintained on paper in the archives of foreign ministries without becoming a source of conflict on the ice. The continent would function as if those claims did not exist, as if the lines drawn on maps in London and Buenos Aires and Santiago were merely lines, with no power to divide what the cold had united. Nor did the treaty attempt to predict the future. It did not address the possibility of mineral extraction or the exploitation of Antarctic resources, recognizing that such questions were beyond the capacity of that moment to resolve. Instead, it established a framework within which those questions could eventually be considered, when and if they became urgent. The treaty would be reviewed, modified, extended, as circumstances required. It was not a final settlement, but a beginning, an opening onto a different way of thinking about how human beings might inhabit the places they have not yet learned to destroy. The language of the treaty is spare, legal, unadorned. It speaks of freedom of scientific investigation and international cooperation. It prohibits nuclear explosions and the disposal of radioactive waste. It provides for inspections by observers from any signatory nation, ensuring that no military activity can be concealed. It declares that Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. These are not the words of poetry or vision. They are the words of law, carefully crafted to survive the pressures that would inevitably test them. And yet, read in the quiet of a library, with knowledge of what the world outside those windows contained in 1959, they carry a quality almost of wonder. Here, in the midst of an age defined by division and suspicion, 12 nations agreed to leave a place empty. The ice itself had taught them something, not in words, not in arguments, but in the sheer force of its presence. To stand on that plateau, to feel the cold seep through every layer of insulation, to watch the horizon dissolve into whiteness without end, this was to understand that some places are not meant for possession. The continent demanded respect, and respect, in this instance, took the form of restraint. The nations that signed the treaty did not renounce their ambitions. They simply agreed to set them aside, to allow Antarctica to remain what it had always been, a place apart, a zone of silence and emptiness and cold, where the only sounds would be the wind and the voices of scientists and the creak of ice moving imperceptibly toward the sea. 50 years later, the treaty remains in force. Other nations have joined, other agreements have been layered upon it, but the core holds. Antarctica is still a continent without armies, without borders that matter, without the ordinary machinery of human conflict. The claims remain frozen on paper, the ice remains frozen in fact, and the quiet miracle of 1959 continues, as unlikely now as it was then, a testament to the possibility that human beings can, on rare occasions, choose not to take what they could. To walk into McMurdo Station on a summer afternoon is to encounter a paradox that the first explorers could never have imagined. Here, on the volcanic rock of Ross Island, where Scott and Shackleton once huddled in wooden huts against the wind, a small American town has taken root. More than 1,000 people live and work in this place during the austral summer, occupying buildings that rise 2 and 3 stories above the frozen ground. The noise of generators and vehicles fills the air, a mechanical hum that never quite stops, that becomes the background against which all other sounds must measure themselves. Heavy trucks move along graded roads. Aeroplanes land on the ice runway, bringing fresh supplies and new faces. The place has the feel of a mining town, a frontier outpost, a construction site, all at once. And yet the frontier here is not the edge of settlement, but the edge of the habitable world itself. The heart of McMurdo is not its laboratories or its dormitories, but its common spaces. The galley serves 3 meals a day to anyone who walks through its doors, the food hot and plentiful, the coffee always available. On Friday nights there is ice cream. On holidays there are decorations and special menus, and the determined effort to recreate the comforts of homes that lie thousands of miles away. People sit at long tables and talk about their work, their families, the weather, the ordinary subjects of human conversation anywhere. But outside those windows, the temperature hovers at 30 below, and the wind scours the ice, and the nearest city is 5 days away by ship. Further inland, at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, the isolation deepens. The station that stands today is not the one built in 1957. It has been replaced, expanded, modernized, a gleaming silver structure raised on stilts above the accumulating snow. During the summer, scientists and support staff number around 150. During the winter, that number falls to 50 or fewer, and for 8 months, there is no way in or out. The Winter Rovers, as they call themselves, will not see the sun rise again until August. They will not feel unfiltered daylight on their faces until September. They will live in the bubble, under the dome of their own making, while the plateau does what it has always done, freeze and wait and hold its silence against all intrusion. Inside that bubble, life arranges itself around patterns that would be familiar to the men of the heroic age, though the details have changed. There is still a library stocked with books chosen for their ability to distract and sustain. There is still a schedule, meals at fixed hours, work assignments rotating through the days. There is still the careful attention to clothing, the ritual of drying and repairing and preparing for the next excursion into the cold. But there are also things those earlier explorers could not have dreamed of. High-speed internet connects the station to the outside world, though the satellites that provide it must be carefully positioned and maintained. Video calls allow Winter Rovers to see the faces of their families, to watch their children grow, to maintain bonds that would otherwise dissolve in the long dark. The greenhouse at the South Pole represents something more than mere sustenance. It is a small room, brightly lit with grow lamps, where herbs and vegetables push upward from soil that has been flown in at great expense. The smell of growing things, of damp earth and green leaves, fills the space with an aroma that seems almost shocking in this context. There is no soil outside. There are no leaves. The world beyond the walls is white and sterile and still, and yet here, in this capsule of warmth and light, basil flourishes, cherry tomatoes ripen on the vine. Lettuce spreads its tender leaves toward the artificial sun. The Winter Rovers come here not only to harvest, but to sit, to breathe, to remind themselves that the living world still exists, that they have not been entirely absorbed into the dead zone. At the Russian Vostok station, where the temperature has fallen to nearly 90 below Celsius, the greenhouse takes a different form. Here, in the coldest regularly inhabited place on Earth, scientists tend small plots of moss and algae, studying how life adapts to extremes. The plants grow slowly, if at all. Their existence a kind of defiance, a refusal to accept that this place has defeated them. The station itself sits above Lake Vostok, a vast freshwater lake buried beneath 2 miles of ice, sealed off from the world for millions of years. The scientists who drill into that ancient water are reaching back in time, sampling an ecosystem that has evolved in complete isolation, that may hold clues to how life could survive on other worlds. At the German Neumeier station, on the Ekstrom ice shelf, the base is built on stilts that can be raised each year to compensate for snow accumulation. The station will eventually be buried, crushed, abandoned, replaced by another structure built on the same principle. This is the rhythm of human presence in Antarctica. temporary, adaptive, always aware that the ice will outlast any building, any station, any nation. The Germans who winter here study the atmosphere and the seismic activity and the movements of the shelf itself, contributing their data to the global network that the Antarctic Treaty made possible. Across the continent, at dozens of stations operated by more than 30 nations, the same patterns repeat with local variations. At Australia's Davis Station, there is a library of several thousand volumes and a tradition of midwinter celebrations that involve elaborate costumes and homemade entertainments. At China's Zhongshan Station, the scientists practice Tai Chi in the limited space available, maintaining physical and mental discipline against the cold. At the South African Sunai 4 base, built into the side of a mountain ridge for protection from the wind, the winter rovers mark the passage of time with movie nights and shared meals and the slow accumulation of days until the sun returns. Each of these stations is a bubble of warmth in a frozen world, a capsule of human life suspended in an environment that offers nothing to support it. The heat that keeps them alive is generated by fuel brought across oceans and sea ice, burned in generators that must be maintained through the long dark. The food that sustains them is shipped in once a year, stored in freezers that are colder than the outside air only because they can be kept at a consistent temperature. The water they drink is melted from snow, processed through systems that recycle every possible drop. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is taken for granted. Everything that keeps them alive has been carried here at enormous expense and effort, a constant reminder that they are guests in a place that does not welcome guests. And yet they come. They volunteer for the winter rovers, knowing what the isolation will cost them. They spend years of their lives in these capsules, studying the ice and the sky, and the strange biology of the continent's edges. They build greenhouses and libraries and gymnasiums, recreating the ordinary world inside the extraordinary one. They bake bread and watch movies and call their families on satellite phones, maintaining the rituals of home in a place where home seems impossibly distant. The bubble holds. The warmth persists. And outside, the ancient ice continues its patient work, grinding mountains to dust, flowing toward the sea, waiting for the bubbles to fade and the warmth to dissipate, and the silence to return to what it always was. The winter night at the South Pole lasts from mid-February until late August, 8 months during which the sun never rises, during which the only light comes from stars and aurora and the artificial glow of the station itself. For the men and women who choose to remain through that darkness, who volunteer for the isolation that others cannot imagine enduring, the experience changes something fundamental in the architecture of the mind. It is not merely loneliness, though loneliness is present. It is not merely boredom, though boredom must be managed with the same care as fuel and food. It is something deeper, a rewiring of perception itself, a shift in the relationship between the self and the world that can take years to understand and may never fully reverse. The phenomenon has many names. Winter over syndrome is the clinical term, the one that appears in research papers and medical reports, but those who have lived through it speak of it differently. They describe a dulling of the edge of thought, a slowing of mental processes that mirrors the slowing of everything in the cold. They describe changes in sleep patterns, in dream content, in the very quality of consciousness during waking hours. Time itself becomes strange, losing its ordinary markers, stretching and compressing in ways that defy the clocks on the wall. A week can feel like a day can feel like a week. The boundary between them blurs until it hardly matters. Memory behaves differently in the long dark. Some winter rovers report difficulty recalling events from before their isolation, as if those memories belong to another person entirely. Others find that recent memories become vivid to the point of hallucination, playing back with a clarity that seems more real than the present moment. The mind, deprived of external novelty, turns inward and begins to generate its own content. Dreams become more intense, more memorable, more difficult to distinguish from waking experience. Some winter rovers dream in colors they have never seen, of places that do not exist, of conversations with people who cannot be there. The silence itself becomes a presence, not the absence of sound, but something with weight and texture, something that presses against the ears and fills the spaces that sound once occupied. Winter rovers learn to distinguish the different qualities of silence. The silence of a calm night, when even the wind has stopped. The silence of a storm, when the wind is present but muffled by snow. The silence of the station at 3 a.m, when everyone else is asleep and the machines seem to hold their breath. Each silence feels different. Each silence carries its own emotional tone, its own message for those patient enough to listen. And some who listen long enough begin to hear something else. They describe it in different ways, but the core experience is consistent, a sense that the ice is not dead, not inert, but alive in a way that has nothing to do with biology. They feel the continent breathing, though they know it has no lungs. They sense its slow movements, its ancient patience, its vast indifference to the tiny creatures crawling across its surface. This is not hallucination, not in the clinical sense. It is more like empathy, a reaching across the boundaries of being, an intuition that life is not the only form of presence in the universe. The connection to cosmos becomes palpable in the long night. With no daylight to obscure them, the stars hang overhead in numbers that city dwellers cannot imagine. The Milky Way casts shadows. The Magellanic clouds drift near the horizon like fragments of something larger. The aurora pulses and dances, its colors shifting through the visible spectrum, its movements responding to forces that originate 90 million miles away on the surface of the sun. Standing beneath that display, feeling the cold seep through every layer of insulation, watching light that has traveled for minutes or centuries to reach this place, it is impossible not to feel small, and also impossible not to feel connected. Some winter rovers report a lessening of the ego, a dissolution of the boundaries that normally separate self from world. They find themselves less interested in their own concerns, more attentive to the patterns of wind and stars and ice. They lose track of their own histories, their own identities, in the presence of something so much larger. This can be frightening, especially at first, especially for those who have built their lives around achievement and recognition. But it can also be liberating, a release from the constant pressure of being someone, of maintaining the fiction of a separate self in a universe that knows nothing of such distinctions. The body changes too. Metabolism slows, conserving energy for the long dark. Hormone levels shift, melatonin rising as daylight fades, serotonin falling in response to the absence of sun. Some winter rovers gain weight despite careful rationing. Others lose appetite entirely, forgetting to eat until reminded. The sense of smell becomes more acute, perhaps because smells are so rare, perhaps because the brain is hungry for any input from the environment. The eyes adjust to the darkness, learning to see in levels of light that would seem impossible at lower latitudes. When the sun finally returns, in August or September depending on latitude, the experience is not always joyful. Some winter rovers find themselves mourning the darkness, missing the intimacy of the long night, the sense of being held by something larger than themselves. They have changed during their months of isolation, and the world to which they return has not changed with them. The adjustment can take years. Some never fully adjust, carrying within them always a piece of that darkness, that silence, that strange connection to a continent that breathes without lungs and speaks without words. The flights that carry scientists and support staff away from Antarctica depart from runways carved from ice, from blue ice fields that have been groomed and leveled by months of careful labor. The planes lift into skies that are always cold, always clear more often than not, and the passengers press their faces to the windows for one last look at the continent receding below them. They watch the stations shrink to specks, the mountains fold into the plateau, the vast white expanse resolve itself into the curvature of the earth. And then the clouds close in, or the distance becomes too great, and Antarctica vanishes from view as completely as if it had never been there at all. but it is still there. This is the thought that follows them home, that settles into the quiet spaces of memory and waits there for moments of stillness. Somewhere, right now, snow is falling on a place where no one stands. Somewhere, the wind is sculpting sastrugi that no eye will ever see take shape. Somewhere, a crevasse is opening in slow motion, its walls of blue ice deepening toward a darkness that has never known light. The continent continues its ancient existence without need of witness, without demand for recognition, without any awareness that human beings ever crossed its shores and flew above its plateau and left their temporary marks upon its surface. The marks do not last. Footprints in the snow are erased by the next wind, or the one after that, or the one after that. The tracks of vehicles disappear within a season. Even the stations themselves, the permanent settlements that house generations of researchers, will eventually be swallowed by the ice, or dismantled and removed. The Antarctic Treaty requires it, this cleaning up of human presence, this restoration of the continent to something approaching its original state. But even without the treaty, the ice would claim them in time. It has claimed everything else. What remains is the silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, the quiet that exists, not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening requires no sound. The ice flows, the wind blows, the snow falls and accumulates and compresses into new ice, continuing a cycle that began before there were humans to observe it, and will continue long after the last human has gone. The continent holds this silence as a kind of gift, or perhaps as a kind of testimony, a reminder that the world does not need us to be what it is. Those who have spent time in that silence carry it with them in ways they cannot fully explain. They find themselves listening differently to the ordinary sounds of home, hearing the traffic and the voices and the mechanical hum of civilization as interruptions rather than background. They find themselves missing the quality of darkness they knew in the long night, the depth of stars they could see from the plateau, the strange companionship of a place that asked nothing of them and gave nothing in return. They find themselves changed, and the change is not something they can communicate to those who have not shared it. And so the continent remains what it has always been, a presence at the edge of the world, a keeper of the oldest silence, a place where human ambition meets its limit, and human noise fades into nothing. The scientists will return next season. The winter rovers will volunteer for another year. The nations will maintain their stations and honor their treaty, and continue the slow work of understanding what this place means. But beneath all that activity, beneath all that human purpose and human striving, the ice waits, the wind waits, the silence waits. And in that waiting there is something like peace, something like permission, something like an invitation to rest now, to let the night carry you, to drift off into the quiet that still remains,